and welcome to this edition of IIEA Insights with me, Dan O'Brien, in which we'll discuss the making of foreign policy. And to do that, we're joined by two former foreign policy advisors, Ben Judah, who worked as Special Advisor to British Foreign Secretary David Lammy until recently, and Tom Wright, who was Senior Director for Strategic Planning at the National Security Council in the Biden administration. Before discussing some of the issues they both worked on that are topical today, we'll discuss the role of advisors in how foreign policy is made and other issues around the formulation and execution of policy. Gentlemen, you're both very welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
All right. Tom, can I start with you in terms of what sort of preparation you got to be an advisor? Clearly, you had a long history in think tanks and as an author, and in the US system, you have that longer transition period between election and inauguration. How much prep did you get, and what was it like landing at the new desk on day one?
Thanks, Dan, and it's great to be here with Ben. Not a lot, to be honest. I started in April of 2022, so I wasn't in from the beginning of the Biden administration. I was in for just under 3 years. So there was a little bit of runway. The transition didn't affect me sort of hugely. There is sort of a 3-month transition period for those coming in, as I think most people will be familiar with, from early November until January 20th, when there is sort of prep done. In my case, I had never, obviously I was born and grew up in Ireland, became a US citizen in 2017. So I wasn't eligible really to go into government before. I'd never served before. So, it was sort of a unique, interesting sort of experience to go in, A, without any sort of government experience, and B, in a country in which I wasn't born, in which I was sort of naturalized into, which is just a slightly surreal feeling. I got offered the job, I think in October of 21, and then you go through this long security clearance process. NSC jobs are obviously highly sensitive, and so there's a long prep period, but not necessarily prepping to do the job, more just prepping to make sure you're qualified for it in the, just with all of the background checks and all of that. So when I went in, the other thing to note is, unlike in the UK system, most of the top levels of the US foreign policy world are politically appointed. So it would be the equivalent in the Department of Foreign Affairs that the SecGen will be politically appointed, the Deputy SecGen, the head of the Europe, the head of the EU team in DFA, all of those will be external people and not sort of advisors, but actually, external experts that potentially would be in those specific sort of roles with sort of authorities and legally and policy-wise. And so in the National Security Council, there's about sort of 25 or 20 to 25 different directorates, or at least there was when we were there. Some of those are regional, Europe, East Asia, China, Russia. Some of those are functional, like energy, defense. Ours was one on strategic planning, which sort of cut across all of the different issue areas. So that was the one I was responsible for. I had a team, depending, of about 6 or 7 people, most of whom were drawn from different parts of the government. So there'd be folks who had 15, 20 years experience coming from the intelligence community or the Defense Department or the State Department, and we had a budgetary role as well. So there'd be someone who knew how to do that. So it was sort of a structured thing, but I would say it is a slightly surreal feeling going in, having only really worked in this somewhat academically and conceptually. And then you go in, on the first day, you're working in a SCIF, which means, obviously no, phones, Apple Watches, anything with a connection, you have to leave, at the door. So you have computers that are connected to the internet, obviously, but you're not allowed to bring in anything sort of external. And it's all fairly close quarter sort of work. You have your own sort of office, but you have a team in an adjacent office, and it's super incredibly busy, obviously, in the NSC. So you're just sort of moving from thing to thing. But I think the thing I remember, a couple of quirky things I sort of remember. One is, coming in early in the morning and seeing lots of people with sort of steel suitcases walking around, right? And thinking, oh, folks are sort of traveling But it turned out those were all the CIA briefers come in the morning about 6 a.m. and they have all of their briefing books in these steel suitcases, and they sort of walk around the old executive office building, sort of briefing their customers, the officials. So there were sort of funny things like that, but just getting used to the classification system, getting used to the bureaucracy. I think that for me was just the thing I hadn't really sort of done before that was most sort of striking. And then just the pace of the work where, we sort of try to look in strategic planning at what was coming down the pike a bit, but everything at the NSC is very operational. And we were in the early days at that point of the Russia-Ukraine war, which took up about 60% of my time over the 3 years. And so, so it was just sort of right into that from day one, basically.
Yeah, fascinating. Ben, the system here is much more similar to the system in the UK, far more permanent civil servants. Similar question to you, and what sort of relationship did you have with the civil servants?
Just in terms of looking back at what came as a surprise to me, I'd worked previously as a journalist and a think tanker for many years on sort of Eurasian and Middle Eastern issues in particular. And nothing can really prepare you for when you become a political advisor for conceptualizing policy issues and managing and dealing with policy issues as political problems. So when I started working for the then shadow Foreign Secretary, there was quite a steep learning curve for me to work out how is one dealing with one political problem we had was the perception that Labour might not be fit for government because it will not be able to manage a potential Trump term or have contacts with the Republican Party. So it was managing that problem and trying to dispel that perception, or just tackling issues such as what was going on in the Middle East at the time, not purely intellectually or analytically or even in a policy sense, but what are they politically for us in terms of the politicians standing and in terms of party management, in terms of perception of the politicians and the party in the press. So that was a steep learning curve for me. And when you get into government, one of the things that I found, again, I had to learn fast, and it was sometimes quite difficult, was where is your value add as a political advisor? Because you have teams and teams and teams of people with, it could be 40 years of experience working in intelligence, working as, a key official leading on a Middle Eastern file or a Eurasian file, or, what are you adding there? I think when you are doing a job badly as a political advisor, you've become a sort of extra hand, a sort of extra civil servant. And you can ask yourself at the end of the day, well, what did I actually add here that they wouldn't have been able to find if they just got one extra person come over from MI6 or from the embassy in the embassy in Washington? It's how are you kind of managing this? How are you managing this politically, or processing this politically in terms of what it means for British and Labour politics?
And what value added did you feel that you brought in hindsight?
I think one of the Labour Party had a couple of political problems coming in. One was that the Labour Party didn't have many sort of organic connections with the Republican Party and with the United States. And, I hope that one of the things that I brought to government was an understanding of that. And I was able to build certain relationships, such as between the Foreign Secretary and a bunch of politicians that he might not otherwise have known, including J.D. Vance, that turned into a kind of fruitful and important channel for Labour in power. So that's a kind of an example of what you can do. You can bring contacts forged through politics that the embassy is not going to be able to deliver. One of the things that you can bring is an understanding of how these issues are going to work politically, which is, trying to understanding an issue like Israel, Gaza, not purely as a humanitarian issue, a strategic issue, or geopolitical issue, but what's that going to mean for managing the Labour Party and for community relations in the UK, why, and designing an approach to that, never going to be popular for it, but a methodical approach that saw us suspend arms licenses to Israel, then bring sanctions on kind of members of the Israeli government who are extremists, and then move towards finally recognizing Palestine, designing a political strategy for that that was extremely difficult given the pressures we were going to be under, or the various traps and rocks that we would have had to have faced in that journey. And the third thing is one of the things I kind of was told at the beginning by a senior civil servant was, quite an old one, was Margaret Thatcher was very good because the way the civil service works is politician wants to do something, could you provide us with advice? The advice came up to Thatcher with, here, Prime Minister, here is a neoliberal solution, free market solution, here is a social democratic solution, and here is a mixed economy solution. By the end of her time in office, we only ever put up a free market solution because we knew exactly what she wanted, and there was no point giving other advice. So what the civil service wants is political direction, and that requires a certain degree of ideological direction. Otherwise, every single issue is being proposed in multiple formats. Now, obviously, the foreign policy is complicated and subtle, and you don't want to be too dogmatic with it. But one of the things I helped design for Labour was an approach which we called progressive realism, which is, we want we want a realist foreign policy that is realistic about the threats we face, about the nature of allies and partners, that's honest about what we can pursue, but which is using those tools of realism where possible to achieve progressive ends. You could flip it and say it was a realistic progressivism, but that was one of the things that I hope I contributed, because it meant every piece of advice coming up to the Foreign Secretary was justifying its approach in those terms.
Tom, just similar from your experience, and also in the US system, the relationship between the White House and your role and the State Department, the people who conduct diplomacy formally. Tell us a little about that relationship.
Yeah, it's generally good, but it can be challenging. I mean, the NSC, certainly before the second Trump administration, had, I think, gotten quite powerful. We had about 180 sort of policy staff, but covering, as I mentioned, basically all of the different regions and functional, areas, and then including sort of economic teams and defense teams and intel teams and all of that. And, what that means is that from the State Department's perspective or the Defense Department's perspective, they can sometimes feel the White House is a bit overweening or too sort of centralized and, doing its own diplomacy, a little bit. And so all these departments have, different perspectives. Ben was talking about what he sort of learned. I think one of the things I learned the most was just the internal bureaucracy of foreign policy. And when you see it, the NSC's responsibility for coordinating, that coordination works mainly through a deputies committee meeting several times a week, where the Deputy National Security Advisor convenes the deputy heads of the departments and agencies. In my role, I would have sat in on, on all of those meetings, basically across all issue areas. And so you just get to sort of see how that works. And I think, to Ben's point, the most critical thing, actually, just from an internal communications perspective, even with political appointees, is direction. Is remind people what the president actually wants and what his preferences are. Everyone thinks that they're doing his bidding and they're implementing his policy, but often they're not, right? They're sort of defaulting to whatever sort of the institutional default will be for their department or agency. And so the Deputy National Security Advisor's role is to try to make sure that everyone's sort of on point, everyone's coordinated, and then we agree sort of in a common, position. And in a normal time, that's quite important. In a time of crisis, of which several, occur, that's even more acute, and you might need those sort of on a daily basis. But basically, I think, states' sort of role is more on the diplomacy side. So the NSC will be helping devise sort of the policy, but then they will go out and talk to their counterparts and foreign diplomats and governments. And the NSC would do a little bit of travel, but State Department obviously would do, a lot more and be involved in the diplomacy of the policy.
And Ben, we recently had John Bew here talking to us. Clearly, you crossed over with him for a period of time. What's the relationship between Downing Street and the Foreign Office like? Similar question that I posed to
Two
Tom.
sort of insights I think I would like to share with you. One is when you sit by a foreign secretary and you're in all his meetings or all of her meetings, and you have all this advice coming up. What I learned was that the Foreign Office has very strong ambassadors and very strong regional directors that were all coming up proposing policies that were actually contradictory to a grand strategy. So you have the embassy in Washington that isn't just an embassy, it's really a Whitehall department in Washington, it's so big, always proposing a sort of America is the most important relationship analysis, and therefore we should do this. You'd have a Middle East team that was seeing the world from embassies in the Middle East and from the United Nations that was always pushing, a more human rights, forward approach to foreign policy, shall we say. You had the Russia-Ukraine combined team that was always pushing a more Zelensky and the survival of an independent Ukraine is the most important thing, and our policy should flow from that. And then, of course, you're dealing with the security services because the Foreign Secretary is also the political head of the security of MI6, and they would always come in saying the most important relationships we have are with these intelligence agencies, and this is what it provides for us. So, not actually a lot of that's contradictory. I think that there's a weakness in the Foreign Office, which is that the political director and the permanent undersecretary aren't capable of, getting some of that into shape as a grand strategy. But they would say that's not our role. The role is for a foreign secretary and a prime minister and political advisors to set that, because these are ultimately political decisions. How close are we to the United States or Europe? How close are we? What exactly is our relationship with Israel? To what extent do we prioritize a relationship with Zelensky over a relationship with Trump? All of those are political decisions. I worked not just in the Foreign Office, also worked in the Ministry of Justice for David Lammy when he was Deputy Prime Minister for a couple of months. So I saw the Whitehall machinery in two different ways. Broadly, the machinery of government in Britain, when it comes to foreign policy, actually is quite good. You have a foreign secretary supported by the embassies who is looking at the world really from there, who meets in a National Security Council and interfaces with a National Security Advisor who is supported by a National Security Secretariat in Number 10 in the Cabinet Office, who's focusing on those key relationships that a Prime Minister will be concerned with, the United States, a couple of European countries, and so on. And I never felt that our machinery was bad, that we had the formats where we could do correctly and analyse trade-offs and look at the national interest, and I felt the machinery worked there pretty well. Now, on a domestic brief, the machinery is just sort of not there and works incredibly badly. And Number 10, I think, should actually learn from how the foreign policy machinery works to improve itself. We would be in a much better place if we had, a sort of national domestic advisor and a national economic advisor backed up by a secretariat to sort of manage things like the Home Office or MOJ or the Treasury. Because when I was working in MOJ, my interface with Number 10 was dreadful. There was only one or two harassed advisors that were also covering multiple other departments, including, bizarrely, defence. That meant they had very little time to resolve disputes across government, pay attention to what we were doing, or support us with what we were doing. So the machinery on foreign affairs, I think, is actually quite good. Though I would venture one point is I've long been fascinated by how the Irish system combines defence and foreign policy, and even though I wouldn't suggest that is something that we do in the UK, I think there's a lot that we can learn from that approach, short of merging departments.
Interesting. Tom, on the prioritization of issues, tell us a little about that, and in terms of how much policy is reactive versus proactive.
Yeah, I mean, some of it is, obviously a lot of it is reactive in the sense of responding to world events. I mean, I think the three things that took the most time, the Biden administration, one of which preceded me, were all sort of crises that occurred, right? The Afghanistan withdrawal in the summer of 21, Russia, Ukraine, and then October 7th and Gaza and Iran that followed sort of afterwards. And, those type of events and developments just take up an extraordinary amount of policy bandwidth and power, as they should. I mean, these are sort of, sort of global crises in a way. And, you try to be proactive in that. I mean, in Russia, Ukraine, we had a team probably of about 20, 25 people at the National Security Council working on the war. We would meet with the National Security Advisor basically every single day for about an hour to go over what had happened the previous day, what was coming, down the road. And we were constantly looking for ways to be proactive to see what we could do, to improve Ukraine's position. I'm sure it was similar in the UK as well. So there's all of those issues. But I think in addition to that, then you want to make sure that there are, that other issues don't get short shrift. And so I think one thing we did pretty well is like on the US-China side, which I think was probably the priority of the administration coming in. I don't think that sort of got short shrift at all amid the other crises. I think actually there was sort of methodically a lot of effort put in to laying out sort of an affirmative agenda. We made a lot of progress on the technology side, on the export control regime, on pushing a domestic sort of chips industry, all of that being part of the competitive approach to China. From mid-23 on, there was a very robust track as well. So I think, that also sort of fit in. I think the challenge, and where I think we did okay, but I think the challenge is on, the issues that aren't crises or aren't top tier priorities, but are still quite important. Like, how do you sort of drive, an agenda to engage the global south, or on, climate and energy, or any of these issues? And that's where I think it helps to have, all of when you have these different directorates in a strong National Security Council, you have a dedicated team of 5 or 6 people that's working each of those issues, and they will, generate sort of policy options for the National Security Advisor and the President. And there is sort of a bureaucratic process in place, by which they can be sort of floated up. And I think the leadership was sort of quite committed to advancing, policy goals in each of those areas. But it's, it's constantly the most precious resource is time, obviously. And you end up with every day. I'm sure Ben would agree with this. It's an adventure, and just it can go in very different, directions when you start. One, you go in expecting to work on one thing, and then, there can be a missile fragment lands in Poland, or a Chinese spy balloon, or something else, that ends up sort of setting the agenda for the next few days. But that's sort of the challenge in a way, is sort of to manage that and to make sure that your priorities, including the long-term ones that aren't sort of crises, continue to get attention.
Ben made an interesting point about the quality of governance in the foreign policy area and domestic areas. And I suppose a lot of people in many European countries would feel, at least, or have a perception that domestically governments aren't delivering as quickly and as efficiently as they should. From your perspective on European countries, and I'm sure you had interaction with the bigger European countries, did you get that sense that their foreign policy machine was quite well functioning, or did you notice a difference across the European countries?
I'd like to come to that in a little bit of a roundabout way, if you if you don't mind, just riffing off some of what Tom just said. One of the issues that I found in the Foreign Office, and then working from the Cabinet Office and with Number 10 when my boss was Deputy Prime Minister, is you're dealing with you're working on the back of like huge legacies and institutional patterns that go back, in our case, centuries. Britain is very good on its traditional allies and its traditional enemies. I found that our Russia-Ukraine team was excellent. I found that traditional relationships like we have with the Gulf monarchies, that was all very good. I found the system was able to do impressive work, even in very difficult circumstances when it came to the United States, or the system knew what to do if you asked it to do something on France, Germany, or indeed the European Union. Where the system was not good, and I was frustrated and now I'm just worried, was a lot of that stuff that Tom was talking about, where the domestic and the foreign intersects and leads back to the China challenge. I found that the analytic tissue and the structures simply weren't there when it came to China as a global challenge, and a challenge that's present in every single aspect of technology and resource management, from rare earths to 5G. I found the China team in the Foreign Office, the Cabinet Office, small, underpowered, seeing things through a kind of outdated Hong Kong lens, and we did not do, and were not able to do, or able to pull off what I know that the Biden administration did very effectively, which was to build up a China house inside the State Department that meant that Tony Blinken was constantly being briefed on these global China issues, as far as I understand, and was sort of getting to grips with them and have something equivalent to a lot of what Tom was talking about, the NSC, and I think how Jake Sullivan led on that really well. So that was something that I was, something that I was worried about in terms of our system. And I think since the Biden administration has sort of passed away, that's got much worse. I don't think that we are in this country really concentrating on those issues, and we are defaulting to our comfort zone and to crisis management, and not looking at what might be what are these geoeconomic challenges in 5, 10, 15 years. Now, to come back to the reason that was a roundabout way of answering your question is I don't think a lot of other European countries are either. And I think that's a sort of common problem that they share. But I would say that there's one of the things I learned in the political side of the job is there were a lot of foreign policy issues that would come to the Foreign Secretary's office where we had an actual national security stake in it. We were shaping it. We were part of the solution, and that meant, we were a player. Ukraine, European security, but there were many issues, and I don't think you would ever have got this as an American official. There were many issues where we were just essentially a commentator. And the Foreign Secretary's role was not to solve an international problem with international partners. It was just to comment on what these international problems meant to the British people and to help them understand them. So I think that you have a lot of European countries dealing with matters beyond the EU. I think that a lot of them, about some naming names, I think the percentage where the foreign minister spends his time purely commenting is quite high, and there are not that many European countries where on issues beyond the European continent, you're, as a foreign minister, actually going to be involved in in a lot of these solutions. There are of course some. So I think that's essentially what I'm saying is that if you look at a politician like Sanchez, Sanchez is able to do a lot of domestic politics on issues in the Middle East because he has very little stake and involvement in them. So he can lean into being a domestic commentator and make kind of moral points or political points, whereas that is much harder to do as a British politician because you've got military and security assets in the region and so on and so forth.
Interesting. Now, I want to come to the big question: is this balancing of interests against values, and when they clash, and what your perception, both of you, was in how interests and values were prioritized, how that might have changed over time, both your time in office and more generally over time, if you've observations about that. And I'll come to you, Tom, first on that one. So Tom, values versus interests.
Yeah, I mean, it's always a tension, I think, and the answer is always sort of the same. It's a combination of both, obviously, but I think just to make it maybe a little more granular, I mean, when I came in, one of my first tasks was to, complete and draft the national security strategy in 2022. And that, I think, provides, that's meant to provide you, as Ben was saying, with grand strategy, like an overarching sort of framework for dealing with some of this. We tackled some of those questions in that document, including, the president's autocracy, democracy frame, and sort of pushing democracy globally, and the role of that sort of values competition in sort of US-China, in US-Russia relations. I think for Ben raised a really interesting point just on the domestic commenter versus, having a lot of assets in a region or area where you then end up having this clash. I mean, I think that's obviously particularly true of the US, that has sort of a global system, of alliances and partnerships, and obviously a forward deployed sort of military, and also sort of is the default power for other countries to go to figure out like how to address something, in any given moment. I think the biggest, clash obviously was the post-October 7th sort of war in Gaza. But let me just pull back from that a minute to give you a more concrete, a concrete example from before, that time, which was relations to Saudi Arabia. And so the president had, condemned Saudi Arabia before becoming president. There then was, some reprimand for the Khashoggi killing sort of early on. But then we moved toward a policy that was looking for normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And that would have included basically a treaty between the US and Saudi Arabia akin to NATO or US-Japan, where the US would be obligated to defend Saudi Arabia if it was attacked, which is not something that's currently in place, and to give them a few other things in exchange for Israel making concessions on the treatment of Palestinians, for normalization, and then for some Saudi assurances on relations with China. That was very, controversial. I think some people felt it was, a betrayal of what President Biden had said, before, and also, the U.S. values would mitigate in the other direction. On the other hand, this was potentially a concrete way, and this is pre-October 7th, but this was potentially a concrete way of actually making progress, if not on a two-state solution, toward a two-state solution, if Bibi Netanyahu, for instance, was persuaded to give concessions, maybe switch coalition governments in Israel in pursuit of this. And so that's something we would have talked about, quite a lot. And I think, I don't think there's sort of a clear right or wrong answer there. I think it depends on one's perspective. It's a legitimate, topic of debate, an argument. But I think that's the type of, diplomatic and policy problem that you will confront sort of in the US system when you're trying to balance these up. And the question is, do you ostracize Riyadh and actually not, pursue these, and then not potentially get the benefits of that deal, to make the point sort of on human rights? Or do you try to, engage, in which case you are maybe to some extent compromising, the values piece of the equation?
And Ben, your take on the interest versus values?
Well, what we were trying to do with progressive realism was try and find a way for the British centre left to talk about foreign policy and to conceptualise foreign policy in a difficult, tough, changing world, darker in a lot of ways. And the point we're trying to make is that you can't achieve progressive change unless you're realistic about the world, unless you take the world as it is, not as you might wish it to be. And what we were reacting against was, things like the Labour Party's manifesto in 2019, when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the party, in which he said that he wanted to make pursuing peace in the Middle East a priority, but he simultaneously wanted to blow up the relationship the UK has with Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Egypt, all over different human rights issues, which are, of course, themselves important. But if we had done that, that would have completely removed us from even any ability to be a shaping voice in the background for the geopolitics. So what we were trying to put forward is that, a progressive realist approach to the Middle East is acknowledging that not only are the Gulf monarchies extremely rich, extremely capable, but becoming richer and more powerful, and really they've joined the sort of greater West as another set of hyper-capable states, even though they haven't joined the West per se, just to be clear. And we're going to have to work with them on a whole series of issues to advance actually our values in the region. I guess one thing to sort of share before we kind of go to the floor is one of the things I learned being particularly a British official is it's not just the old truism, which is, the weak do what they must. The weak, the strong do what they can and the weak do what they must. It's that the strong can say whatever they want, as Trump illustrates to a degree, and the weak can only say what they must. And I felt very, very acutely that there was a huge yawning gap between what was actually going on in terms of the reality of our relationship with the United States under Trump, or the reality of the threat posed by China, or the reality of certain things that Gulf countries were doing, and what one could actually say in public without really damaging those relationships and then cutting into vital national interests. And I felt that we got the balance a little bit wrong there, and we needed to lean in to a degree, being more sort of open with the public and taking a slightly more risks, just so that they would listen to what we were saying.
Okay, I'm going to have two specific ones to finish before I go to a question. Tom, China. Trump in his first term, I think, was possibly ahead of the posse in terms of seeing China as a threat. You, as you said and said here before, you focus a lot on China. In this term, Trump seems to be much more dovish on China. Can you explain? Do you know what's going on with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think his team was divided in the first term, and I think he was somewhat on the fence. He wanted a deal, but there was a division, and then the people close to him then, their view is that after COVID, he basically flipped and became much more hawkish. And so the China hawks from Trump term one believed that they basically got most of what they wanted on the tech side and on other areas after March of 2020, basically. I think what we saw this time was that he, time maybe had healed some of his feelings on that. He wanted, I think he did engage in a trade war, obviously, with China very aggressively. I think he was slightly taken aback by their reaction, both in terms of the rare earth, the critical mineral export controls, but also just the fact that, tariffs and like basically ending trade with China deprives China of money, but it deprives the US of goods. And actually money is more fungible and replaceable than goods. And so the US is very exposed in some highly sensitive areas like hospital machine parts and other critical sort of elements that you need just to keep the economy sort of going. And so he pulled back from that trade war, and ever since, I think he's been tracking toward a deal, and he believes in the leader-to-leader bond with Xi Jinping, which I think for most of us, is very fantastical and almost ridiculous. This is a guy who is Xi Jinping, who has turned on many of his closest associates within China, so he's not going to be bound by a leader-to-leader bond with a foreign leader like Donald Trump. But he's pulled back from the competition part, and I think that's created some sort of anxiety here on tech export controls, and on he's not really working with Europe on dealing with China's overcapacity problem, which is, Dan, is just probably the biggest challenge coming from China at the moment in terms of affecting other countries. And I think that's likely to continue. I mean, we had the meeting in Beijing last week. There are probably 3 more engagements between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump later this year, a Chinese state visit to Washington, but then also meetings at APEC and the G20. And so I'd expect to see that attempt at détente continuing for the rest of this year.
Ben, Brexit. Will Britain rejoin the EU, and if so, when?
I think that the next election in the UK is in some ways a second referendum in all but name. If Nigel Farage wins by uniting the rights and the right-wing bloc that's now divided into multiple parties around reform and establishes a reform government, a reform-led government, he will leave the European Charter on human rights, which will make any return to the European Union much harder and will complicate and sour our relationships with lots of European countries, especially with Ireland. And it will then permit him to actually diverge quite dramatically in terms of how we manage migration and in terms of how we manage certain aspects of the economy, some things of which will be very popular with parts of the British population, that's such as pushbacks of small boats coming in the channel, and it will make returning much harder. However, if the Labour Party wins, establishes a Labour government or a Labour-led coalition, we will see the next prime minister move towards somewhere, at least somewhere on the customs union or on the single market, which will unlock a greater degree of growth, which will be very appreciated in the UK, and people will be very, very cautious to turn it off again. And that government can then illustrate that the growth is coming out of this closer relationship with the European Union. Once we're on that track of going up Barnier's famous Brexit staircase of different models, from an Australia-style deal to full membership, the case for rejoin and the campaign for rejoin will get louder and louder. Why has that campaign kicked off now? I think it's happened for a couple of reasons. One is that 10 years on, with the damage now so visible and the economy in such doldrums, something was always going to snap. But because the left is split in this country, and if one of the ways to bring it back together for the Labour Party would be to propose to rejoin the EU. Now, will the next Prime Minister in the next manifesto propose to re-enter the EU? I think it will probably look something like this. I think that the best, and this is an example of political thinking and foreign policy, I think the best thing to do would be either for the next Prime Minister, if they come to power soon about a general election, or they come to power just before the general election, to propose a series of tests modelled on Gordon Brown's tests on joining the euro. And that is a very neat way to manage the debate. The test could be what makes us safer, what relationship with Europe makes us safer, what relationship with Europe makes us richer, and what relationship with Europe helps us to best manage migration. So that puts the debate onto terrain that's friendly to you, because you're moving it off conceptual issues like sovereignty or identity, which favour the other side, onto more, onto metrics which benefit your side. It allows you to keep excited rejoiners on side because they're expecting positive tests. And of course, you can make the decision of how the tests have gone based on what works for you, what works for you politically.
Folks, we've come to the 45 minutes. So look, I'd like to thank you both for those invaluable insights into what it's like to be involved in making foreign policy. So thank you both, and thanks to our audience as well. Have a good afternoon, everyone.